I'm Abby Sun, the curator of the Dockyard, and I'm here to present the Q&A with the filmmakers of The Rifleman, Sierra Pettengill and Daniel Garber. The Rifleman is screening with Kevin Rafferty and James Ridgway's film Feed from 1992, and this will be available for free on our Eventive site until 11:59 Saturday Eastern Time. So it's right before the time change to keep it easy for everyone. This Q&A will be recorded and it will be archived on Facebook Live immediately afterwards and on our YouTube channel by tomorrow morning. For our Q&A, we do have to thank quite a bit of people because even though it's a virtual screening, there were lots of folks who helped make this screening happen. First of all, Jen and Lida are colleagues at the Left Foundation, of which the Dockyard is a program. I'd also like to thank Ned, Ivy, Brandon, and all of the staff at the Brattle Theater. You can still reserve, if you are in the Boston-Cambridge area, private screenings for your quarantine pod or just other friends at the Brattle. I'd also like to thank Kino Lorber and Field of Vision for making these films available to us, to Sierra and Daniel for joining us for the Q&A, and most of all to Kayla Myers, the Dockyard series producer, who is working her magic behind the scenes. And you can see her in the chat box here and on Facebook Live. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I and many of us in this audience are physically located in what is currently known as the Greater Boston area. These are the traditional lands of the Massachusetts and Pawtucket people. And since we're gathered here to discuss a film about archives, or the lack of specific archives from an organization, I'd also like to encourage us all to reflect on how many museums and institutions in the US and around the world have built their collections on stolen artifacts from Indigenous lands, as well as the destruction or deliberate ignoring of Indigenous forms of knowledge. That might include oral or nonverbal ways of preserving collective memory. And because we're going to be talking about media effects, I do think that this is an important space for us to all reflect on what it means to engage in forms of allyship. So on that note, because we are gathered here collectively, even if we are not physically present, I do encourage everyone also to use the chat box. Please remember to set, if you want to chat to everyone, to set the options to panelists and attendees. If you're here in Zoom, we are also monitoring Facebook Live. And yeah, so joining me here on screen shortly will be Sierra Pettengill. Sierra is one of our treasured filmmakers and archivists in the field of independent film. Both of her two previous features, Town Hall and The Reagan Show, were broadcast nationally and shown as part of prior Dockyard seasons. She has also produced and worked as an archivist on films like the perennial documentary favorite, Cutie and the Boxer, Teenage, Gimme Danger, 20th Century Women, Our New President, Won't You Be My Neighbor, among many others. Other than her work as a filmmaker, Sierra is also a film critic, writing for publications like Freeze, and she was one of the organizers of the Cinema Worker Solidarity Fund, which raised over $75,000 for New York City theater employees whose livelihoods were affected by the still continuous shutdown of New York theaters because of COVID-19. Joining us also will be Daniel Garber, who is the editor, and with Sierra, one of the co-writers of The Rifleman. Daniel joining us is also evidence of Sierra's collaborative nature, as Daniel previously worked as an editor on both The Reagan Show and edited Graven Image, Sierra's 2017 short about the history of the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial and how Southern state legislatures have enshrined racist dictates into constitutional law. Daniel was last at the Dockyard this past spring as the editor of Lance Oppenheim's Some Kind of Heaven. And yes, in the interest of full disclosure, Daniel and I are classmates from our undergraduate years, and we have collaborated ourselves on some short documentaries. So Sierra and Daniel, will you join us on screen?
Hi, Abby. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so Thanks for joining us on this. Well, at least it's raining here in Boston. Is it raining also in Brooklyn?
It is very much raining. Yeah. The positive side of that is that my heat came on for the first time this year. So, uh,
Oh my gosh.
celebration.
Small, small victories as we hurtle towards next week and beyond. So yeah, so I do want to start actually by bringing up a Letterboxd review that specifically mentions your collaboration. It's also a good transition um, into my first question. But before I get there, I would like to say I am, in the interest of providing a physical descriptor, I am an Asian American woman wearing a black sweater. I am in a very yellow room, and there's some windows behind me. So on that Letterboxd review, um, after the recent sort of premiere, I don't know, do we call these things premieres anymore? In virtual
Yeah.
age of The Rifleman, there's one review that stated, always excited to see what Sierra Pettengill and Daniel Garber cook up, and this did not disappoint. It's the kind of film I could never make because I'm just not wired that way, nor would I be able to stomach spending time with this a-hole on display, referring to Harlan Carter, subject at the heart of this film. So um, to me, that's a sign that people have recognized the two of you have worked together multiple times over the past, but also about the strength of the archival footage that you've used for this film and how impactful it might be. So on that note, I would like to start just by tracing all of the sources of archival media that you have used. So clearly, and it's a lot, and so what I've noticed, for instance, when watching, besides the media or advertisements produced by the NRA itself, we also get a glimpse of another kind of gun culture as promoted by the Black Panthers, which seems to be developing in parallel with that of the NRA, and of print journalism reporting on this contested territory. And so then to me, the project of the film is to dig beneath it all, draw connections that weren't drawn at the time or that we've forgotten through the decades. You have print ads, you have private papers, perhaps. What is it all? Where did you look for this material?
Yeah, and I will also start with a descriptor. I'm Sierra Pettengill, and I am a white woman in my late 30s with curly hair in a room with bookshelves and a single lamp. I, I love that you sort of outlined the set of archives, Abby, because I think for me, the way I approach these films and the reason to make them at all really is to try to go through the record and try to put the pieces together in a way that clarifies how things kind of came into being for myself, and so we begin with scholarship, but there is also an extended period of just going through every possible media that feels relevant that can be found, and trying to kind of puzzle this out backwards in some way. And the sources that come into play here feel very, are very deliberately chosen. And a lot of times, and I think particularly in this film, Daniel and I are trying to reflect a kind of mainstream power structure and the media outlets that convey that, and point to those methods of communication as much as we are trying to tell, another story that perhaps whose narrative is more obvious, like in The Rifleman. So for this film, I think finding the Laredo Times, which is the Texas border newspaper, which has a Spanish language edition and an English edition, they really covered in depth this trial in a way that gave like full character to most everyone involved. And that felt like it was a counterpoint to other media accounts of both the U.S. Border Patrol, which were very complicit in the telling of the deportation story, and also, obviously the NRA's sort of propaganda machine. So that was a really sort of late breaking, I think, archive that I think gives a lot of the sort of texture of the end of the film.
Yeah, I'm curious when you talk about this idea that mainstream media might be complicit in narratives, this being that the NRA is perpetuating about themselves. Um, this is super basic question, but I'm curious, how do you identify what is complicit and what is not? Like when you stumbled upon the Laredo Times, like how how did you know that that was going to be kind of it is the literal capstone to this film, for instance?
Yeah, I mean that complicity, it's an easy word to throw around and a harder one to sort of pinpoint, I think, when you're trying to survey them, and I felt that watching Feed, like what a complicated interweaving of all of these different aspects of society that you can hardly disentangle them. Um, and for the Rifleman, the sort of simplest part of that is and I hate repeating the name of the operation that Harlan Carter was the architect of, but Operation Wetback, which is what he called it, which was the massive, very violent deportation of Mexican Americans in the 50s. The most recent scholarship, and also I think at the time around that operation, was that it was designed as a media event. And it's very sort of documented the way that the press was invited in. They did these sort of the footage that's in the film is very much a reenactment, and very clearly a reenactment. And we edited that to feel, or Daniel edited that to feel very obviously constructed for the media presence. And so that was sort of the most obvious and tangible example of that is the operation and its place in the media were one in this, were designed together as one program.
Yeah, and thank you also for bringing up Feed, because I mean that is a film. When I've talked to other people about Feed, for instance, there does seem to be, because it wasn't created, that film, as a historical archive. It was something that was happening very much in the present. And the material that comprises about 80% of Feed wasn't intended to be archived at all. It was intended to be ephemeral material that was discarded and never seen, immediately to be discarded. And it was essentially intercepted, stolen. There's been all of these descriptors of it in the media. But what you didn't have access to that because you're not making the Rifleman in the moment. You're going back and digging through things. So one of the things that I found, I do want to move on to in terms of, because the thing with Feed is when I've been talking to other people who have seen Feed through our screening, is that they didn't actually quite understand what was intercepted satellite footage and what was filmed by Kevin Rafferty himself, because he also filmed part of that film. And to me, that's super interesting because it is a distinction that I think you both try to draw very concretely in The Rifleman. For instance, for me, the use of black space, and looking outside of the frame, sometimes we see handwriting that denotes the source of the archival material. Um, this idea of paratext, I think, rarely shows up in documentary film, even in films where there's obviously archival images, unlike in Feed, where you can tell, the source doesn't come perhaps from the contemporaneous filmmakers making it. We don't usually know where the archival material comes from. It is used as B-roll to illustrate kind of the interviews that people are talking about. Doesn't really fight back against what's being said on screen. Whereas in this film, you're trying to do many things. So either Sierra, Dan, I, could you talk about some of the challenges that you are working through when you're working with a visual archive that is seeking to advance something so fundamentally different from what you're trying to draw in the film?
I'm gonna let Dan take that one, and I should also say I love that you read that Letterboxd review, because I find filmmaking is like so inherently collaborative,
Mhm.
and it is always frustrating to me that one has to go out of their way to emphasize that in some ways in the way that the media industry is structured. And Dan and I have made 3 archival films together now, and I don't they wouldn't exist without the alchemy of the 2 of us doing that, in my opinion. So um, yeah, it's crucial that he's here to be part of the conversation.
Well, thanks. It's always good to be in a conversation with the 2 of you, and always good to be back at the dockyard, even if it has to be virtually, which is really not the same. Also, just a physical descriptor: I'm a half Asian man in a mostly white room with a bookcase on one side and my roommate's bike hanging on the other. Yeah, I think one of the challenges in working with archival material is that there is always a context that exists in how the archival material is being produced, who thought it was necessary to preserve it. There's usually some kind of agenda, and the challenge of making an archival film is always to break those images free from their original context and make them serve some other vision that the filmmaker is advancing. But I think that that's something that a lot of filmmakers don't always come to grips with. And I think that that's one of the things that Sierra has always done so well from the first time we worked together, and even before. She's always very acutely aware of who's creating these images and why. And in the context of the NRA, I think it's particularly challenging because they are a notoriously secretive and cagey organization. And so they're too smart after all this time. They're too smart to simply come out and say exactly what they're trying to do or who they think should own guns and who should not. It's always sort of coded. And when you see this like NRA educational film from the 1970s, it's not about everybody should own guns. It's really framed in terms of defending the I guess the sanctity of like white womanhood. And so there are different sorts of symbols that are being advanced in this kind of material. So it's always essential to think about who is producing these images, who's writing these texts, and why. I don't know, Sierra, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think a reason, yeah, the NRA is incredibly difficult, obviously. That we did not have access to their archive. This film is a short film that took almost a year, in part because it just trying to pull what we could from, there was just a really labor intensive research process and editing process, which happened at the same time. I think the benefit of working with archival material, particularly for an organization like the NRA, is that what Daniel's saying, that code through time becomes, less and less coded. It's very obvious to us from 2020 when you're seeing, protect the white woman, the sanctity of the white woman from predators in the shadows. We understand what that meaning is, and so I think there's always a trick to trying to remain contextually true to the time period that you're working in, while also making sure that the material resonates into the time, into now. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but there's this way that the code kind of it has been revealed, and I'm sure and was obvious in the 60s and 70s as well. But I think there's a we can shorthand that in some way in this film.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the the not the tricks, but one of the characteristics of dominant forms of history is that it elides connections that were formed in the past. I think that not many people would argue, right, with the NRA being a very racially biased organization these days, especially with the demographics of their membership and these overt phrases that they use these days, but the fact that this history stretched back so far and is such a fundamental part of the politicization of the work, I think that is, one of the benefits also of using the archive is saying, this isn't just something that's new, but it's something that came from the past as well.
Yeah, and I also think I would add to that and what we were just saying that, I think we also can have this really blinkered view of like we in the present know better than, how far we've evolved and how much smarter and more refined we are, which I think tends to be mostly false and self-flattering in a lot of ways. And, and I think in this film, the Black Panthers were an incredibly important to include for many reasons. It's a very overt illustration of the racism of the NRA, but also for the Black Panthers calling it what it is in real time at that moment. They're making a law against us. That's the only reason this law exists. It was as clear then as it is now. It's not, we haven't evolved into some sort of like all-seeing wisdom suddenly. I think it's the power of editing to put these things in conversation and sort of resurrect a narrative that was buried.
Yeah. And I think thank you for also naming it that way. Also, I think oftentimes when we watch archival films, it's like, oh, the filmmaker discovered something. But of course, there are all of these other alternate histories have been recorded. They just, might not have come to our consciousness. So just as a reminder to the audience, you can ask questions at any point. I just realized that I forgot to say that. You can ask questions at any point via the chat box or the Q&A function within Zoom or within the chat box in Facebook. And I do have some questions that were emailed to us beforehand. Before I get to those and to allow people to have time to think up questions, if you have any, I do have one last question. And that is to do with this idea of media effects. The fact that what people produce, what broadcast journalism, what broadcast media produces affects the way that people think. The ads that the NRA produces, the print and the visual, the broadcast ads that you have incorporated, that they produce people's narratives of what the NRA is about, this gun club protecting the sanctity of the white woman. Commonly, we think that media produced by an organization is for one purpose. So in this film, then you have the challenge of dealing then with this rhetoric that's produced by these organizations that might be actively harmful then and now. So in your film, you not only have a content warning at the beginning of the film because of what people like Harlan Carter and other people in the film are saying, the name Operation. And then there's also in the late chapter 5 prologue reveal, there's a really harrowing, violent, traumatic story that's retold. So I'm curious if you can talk about the things that you were thinking about in terms of balance versus dramatization, in terms of the writing of the story, when to reveal things. How do you make a film like this penetrating and revealing for those to gain something from it, at the same time not re-traumatizing those affected by racist gun culture?
I can start and I'll let Daniel jump in. I think that conversation is also a reason this film went on for so long, is Daniel and I really picking through that in a really minute fashion over and over again to figure out that balance. I mean, I think it's important to see the language that's being used and in its and recognizing its harm, but it is equally important that the film clarifies that language and violence has done real harm, and that is literally keeps me up at night. And Daniel and I were changing the film's edit really until the very last second based on like gut level reactions to making sure that balance hadn't tipped too far in one direction. I think that is a big reason that the end of the film is at the end. I mean, it is a prologue. The something we talked a lot about was trying to, and which is very hard in a short film, is to allow some of that balance to come out through providing as much sort of visual humanity as possible. And so, you know, we started the film on the border quietly, just kind of watching people work for a minute, and then end with this violence against Ramon Casiano. We don't visualize the violence for the most part, particularly that violence, and it did not feel right to begin a film with something shocking. You know, I'm really, really suspicious, and Daniel, actually, I think even more so than I, about, you know, the lure of true crime, or the shocking and scandalizing, and trying to fight those instincts. You know, I was really adamant. You know, we got some notes at the beginning of the film. It's not paced fast enough, and there's not enough excitement in it, and it takes a long time to get into the story. And I was like, great, that if you are kind of lulled into boredom at the beginning, that's actually I prefer that. You know, the dictates of pacing and audience engagement for me took a back seat, and that felt like the small way I could sort of grapple with that. But I would love to hear Daniel on.
Yeah, I mean, it's always it's a fine line to walk here, because on the one hand, in attempting to make an archival film, you're reproducing media that has existed before, but at the same time, we can't absolve ourselves of whatever the sins of the present day media are. I mean, we're still participating in the dissemination of images and narratives. And so there has to be like a degree of humility in how we approach these narratives and in what we choose to reproduce. And this is something that I think about a lot in terms of I don't know, archival films about people who have died. Sometimes they're celebrities, and people think that because these are stories that have happened in the past, they don't have to have a lot of scruples about how they choose to present those images.
Same ethics of privacy that you would adhere to if the person were still alive.
Right, right. I think that's something that people need to think more critically about, and so that's something that we try to bring to this process, and especially given everything that's happened in 2020. I mean, we started this process. Sierra started the process with her research back in late 2019, and a lot has happened since then. And the film has needed to change in response to what we see as the shortcomings in film in 2020 and in the way that people discuss media in 2020.
Yeah, so some of the things that Sierra mentioned were, for instance, starting with seeing images of people on the border labor, not just perhaps dehumanizing them, or letting that go completely into the abstract. For instance, another thing that I'm thinking about, I'm curious if you can just sort of draw out some of the specific decisions that you might have made in relation to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions is, especially in terms of what Sierra was talking about in the beginning at the border, who is considered the subject in a media story? Like when you think of people being deported, primarily that's framed in terms of the action of the government in removing people from a place and putting them somewhere else. And that sort of that reframes it in terms of whoever wields power at that moment, rather than in terms of the people whose lives are being most deeply affected by that decision by people in power. And I mean, this is, I think, one of the other challenges came in the section about the Black Panthers, in part because that is an extremely complex story, one that's deserving of films that are exclusively devoted to the Black Panthers. But the question is, you know, how do you represent the hypocrisy of the NRA by showing the people who at the time were offering a critical perspective and one that's not just phrased in terms of, racial unrest more generally or something.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be really tough because I mean, first of all, to me, like a lot of the same conversations that are happening in the media today also existed at the time that the media that you were working with in the Rifleman were produced, but their valences might be different today versus back then. It might feel more immediate, certain types of media, for instance, cop documentaries, true crime, as Sierra mentioned, they've become more concretized today versus in the past. They're genres that we recognize. Um, so I'm actually there's one very interesting question that we got emailed, and I think you've partially answered this already, and it's for you both. And the question is, what ethical responsibilities do you think filmmakers should have when working with archival materials for nonfiction films, whether their goals lean more towards journalism or art? And how can or should these ethical responsibilities guide or limit one's creative decision-making process?
I love that question. And I could talk about,
Yeah.
There's a few things to consider. One is that part of the reason I think the three films Daniel and I have made together, some of my comfort in using and feeling like I have a right to all this archival material is we tend to be focusing on people and systems who have wielded tremendous power in the negative.
Yeah, so you're punching up, not down.
Punching way up. And I feel no ambiguity about those figures and the concrete harm that they have done. And I feel like I have a right to the Reagan Archive. I feel like we have a right to the Harlan Carter Archive, and to my ethical concerns in using this material towards these ends is, it's mitigated by the fact that I feel like they need to be called to account. That's a much more complicated consideration when you are making something about someone like Daniel's mentioned who may not be alive, but sits someplace less sort of distinct, ethically distinct, and the so that's one consideration. Another one is that I feel a tremendous amount of I don't feel much hesitation to use mainstream television news towards to reinterpret and to call them out for what is, for framing and for all sorts of things. I don't, the ethics of that feel pretty clean. Where it gets, and this is sort of less relevant for the Rifleman, but I guess relevant due to its absence in the film is when, when we're taking community authored archives, when we're taking archives shot by individuals at oftentimes at great risk to themselves, when there's an intimacy and an access that is engendered by someone's particular position in relationship to a subject or a community, that is worthy of much more careful consideration. And in that way, and I've talked about this for other projects, though, I think that you need to treat those archive holders and authors as if they were subjects and collaborators. If you were making a verite film, that is when archive holders, I think, become need to be treated with the same sort of, you form a relationship with those people. You make sure that it feels fair, that there's consent, and so I think that talking about archives as a entirety, as a genre, I think we can lose some of the nuance and the differences of the archives, which I think are incredibly important. It's maybe a similar kind of punching up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have more answer, but I think that's.
Yeah, we could
We could keep
go on and on about this. And we did get a comment. The film Dope is Death does a great job of using archival materials to highlight the contributions the Black Panthers made to the. Yeah, I will say, in fact, this is a co-sponsored Dockyard screening coming up November 19th. That's a Thursday at 7:30 p.m. and it will also be free to everyone. So please join us and Anna Feder of Bright Lights. There will be a Q&A with Mia Donovan, the director of that film. She spent many years working on archive and also speaking of ethics with working with archival materials, the director of that film also spent many years on interviewing and gaining the collaborative trust of the Black Panthers subjects who are featured in her archival materials. So I think it's actually a great example of ethically making archival materials exactly related to the question that we were talking about. I do have another question. So that is, I'm very curious what you think of this, because we so rarely get questions about what you want the audience reaction to be. And so this question is, what questions should we as viewers be asking ourselves whenever a documentary cuts to archival? What do you think a viewer's responsibility is to this material when sharing it or responding to it? Good question.
Mhm.
I'm really curious what you think. Is this even a framing? Like, what do you think of the framing too of the question?
I think it's really interesting. I think the same way, and I mean, this is individual to individual viewers, but for me as a viewer, the reaction I have when there is a talking head on screen, which is, who is this person and why, you know, they're telling me what to think right now, and how do I judge you know, who they are, what their position is, and whether they should be listened to, you know, that kind of voice of authority that happens with the talking head. I think archives don't get the same kind of scrutiny. They're usually used as like proof or evidence of something rather than having their own sort of life. And I know, and you know, sometimes that's okay. You know, we often don't have much, we're not given much authority as a viewer to assess that material. You know, I spend a lot of time in the credits of films pausing the archival credits to try to figure out where things came from, which, you know, is a labor-intensive hobby, I think, to try to assess, yeah, what is this material constructed? You know, what is the story I've just been told? Where does it come from? I don't think it's
Right.
Yeah, and
I mean,
oftentimes it doesn't even match, I find. You know, like it's supposed to be illustrative of a specific place or time, but then you look at where it's coming from, and then it might even be like clear from the other side of the country, or you just don't know
right.
whether it
Right.
actually is.
Well, it's
Yeah.
also what it's trying to tell you, you know, a lot of archival, and we do it in the Rifleman, you know, we're pulling things that are not time specific because and we're using them for mood and feeling, and that's a very different goal than evidence and proof, you know, and I think Daniel and I have very different, our criteria for which, how we're using archival changes on what we're trying to say. When we're showing something as proof, we're much stricter with ourselves than we are with trying to convey a mood and a feeling.
Right. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of questions that people should be asking about why the archival material is being taken as proof, or why the fact that it's archival is often taken as a signifier of authenticity. And I mean, there are plenty of forms of knowledge that exist that are very hard to represent visually. And does that mean that we devalue certain forms of knowledge? For instance, things that reveal truths about systems, but that can't be easily captured by a camera. Whereas there are things that are very easy to represent in images, like what are your associations when you see a broken window, and what are you being made to think about because of other kinds of tropes or narratives that are being laid on top of that image, when there are other kinds of narratives that could be made to exist, but that don't find such ready visual representation.
Right. It reminds me of this essay that Teju Cole wrote in the New York Times last summer about the photograph of the dead father and his daughter in the Rio Grande, and how he wrote that the fact that those types of shocking images that feature violence as being shown as evidence for human rights abuses, that those images in photojournalism start to form the archive of our visual archive of what human rights abuses look like, doesn't actually show the full scope of the systematic complicity of his argument was that instead of being shown those images, we should be shown images of people in suits pushing paper around approving family separation policies, for instance, and that would be a more true depiction of how systems enact things. It's just, an interesting provocation,
Actually, and that's kind of I haven't read that essay, but I will as soon as we get off this call, because that was my reaction in watching Feed, like the banality of a lot of it, and a lot of it's not banal, but a lot of those images feel banal, and that it's something I've thought about a lot in 2020 too. Like, it's also ugly and stupid, but that this is where everything sort of is located. That's where power is located. Yeah, the men in the suits doing innocuous looking things is actually that is the root.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of, so this is going to be the last question before everybody departs. And yes, I will post a link. Yeah, we can link from our Facebook page and Twitter account to that article. It's a super interesting one. And Teju Cole draws upon the theoretical work of a media scholar and theorist named Ariella Azoulay, who's a Palestinian scholar. So I also need to give a shout out to Ariella Azoulay for that. But about the idea of what things look like. So Sarah, if you would like to, I'd like to give you space to talk about the next project that you're working on too. Because it's specifically about, well, I think I haven't talked to you about it, so I'm curious whether or not it is about what things look like, whether or not reenactments, training can help us prepare. So yeah, Sarah has been working for years now on a feature called Riotsville, USA. What can you tell us about that project?
Sure. I'm about 6 weeks into the edit with editor Nels Bangerter. And so, it's that point when what you thought the film is and what it is are starting to fight each other. So this will be a sort of in progress answer. But the film takes as its starting point a series of reenactments that the US military staged on military bases starting in 1968, where for riot training purposes, where half of various battalions dressed as hippies and Black Panthers and various protesters, and then the other half played themselves, and they put on these full day recreations, and police departments from all over the country and the FBI and the CIA were trained there. And that sort of leads off into this larger exploration of this point in time as the beginning of the militarization of the police and all the different ways that all the different iterations of that. So exporting tear gas from Vietnam. There's, a police chiefs conference that happens in Hawaii where they're sort of flown out for a vacation where they're learning riot control. So just the larger universe of the beginning of militarization, with the goal being, I think, there's a lot of goals, but I think there is similar to the Rifleman, like this is a moment where systems are sort of being put into place in real time and you can watch it form. But also there's this narrative about the 60s and about protest movements that, they destroyed themselves or that they fail, or there's, some like sort of inherent failure within them. And I find, that has felt more important to me in the last year or so than it had even before, but sort of watching the forces that are aligned against kind of collective action and identifying them as such, and not accepting that, the world, the world we live in now is sort of an inevitable one rather than a constructed one. So That's
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying.
Through the scaffolding of a constructed reenactment, sounds like it's the perfect vehicle for
Right.
such a story. Well, thank you very much to Sierra and to Dan for joining us for 48 minutes. Longer than that, actually, because we did a tech check right before this Q&A. So thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Round of applause. Just for everybody listening in and for those who are watching on the recorded version of this Q&A, our next screening, you can continue to watch The Rifleman and Feed at the Dockyard Eventive page you can access it through our website, thedockyard.com, through this Saturday, that is October 31st, Halloween at midnight. And our next screening starts next week on November 4th, just a couple day after Election Day, a co-presentation of the newest feature from Renan Alexandrovich called The Viewing Booth. It's co-presented with the Boston Jewish Film Festival. And after that, we will, on November 13th, have the New England premiere, if that means anything virtually, of Ashley O'Shea's Unapologetic, which is co-presented with the Roxbury International Film Festival. Check us our website for the latest updates. And thank you again to Sierra and to Dan.
Thanks,
Thank you
Abby.
so
Thanks,
much,
Kayla.
Abby.
And Lida and
Bye.
Jen.